all, but there is some there is some bit of reservation among academic circles, especially in Indian context, to delve deep into the philosophy of social sciences. Like, where is the reality of social headed towards, or what kind of reality the contemporary advancements in different fields are pointing towards when it comes to the social context. So this talk will be about the philosophy of social science and its connection with the other domains of philosophy, mainly philosophy of science and philosophy of mind. So this was a brief outline of what this talk is going to be all about. Uh, to start, I would say that probably I don't know what kind of audiences we have. I think we have students. We have students. So I should start with a very basic. Uh, as the title suggests, that it's about a reflection on the ontological question. Now, some of you might be knowing what is ontology. We know that ontology is the branch of philosophy that deals with nature of reality, like what is reality in itself. And when we compare that with another important branch of philosophy, we know there is something called epistemology, which is how do we know what that reality is? So to differentiate between what is ontology and epistemology, one can have a very basic formula in mind, that ontology is what is reality or what is there out there, and epistemology is how do we know what is there. So primarily epistemology deals with the question of method, the question of epistemic frames, the thinking frames, what knowledge is all about, what are the frames of reaching to that layer of reality. That is epistemology. And what is reality is ontology. So the talk will be about ontological questions, not epistemological questions. Although one can always argue that ontology and epistemology they don't exist in tight different spheres. There is always an entangled relationship between ontology and epistemology, and that is what contemporary theoreticians have been arguing, that we should be calling it onto epistemology rather than differentiating ontology from epistemology. But to start, we can still argue that ontology and epistemology are two different spheres of philosophy. One deals with the nature of reality, and the other deals with how do we know what reality is, the question of method, the question of epistemic frames. In social sciences, to be very frank, social sciences I would say, have been afflicted. I'm using the word affliction. I know this is a loaded term, but I'll be very frank. I'll be very outspoken about this. Social sciences, I firmly believe, in contemporary times, have been afflicted with some major problem, and that major problem is that it is some way or the other, it is now obsessed with the questions of epistemology on the question of how do we reach what is the question of method, what is the question of reaching to that the question of reality. And no one, very few in social sciences are asking these questions. Maybe with the quantum turn, with the ontological turn, they are asking, but till 2000, early 2000, till early 2010, very few were asking these questions of what is reality. I mean, what is social reality, and what is the connection between social reality and physical reality? Can we have a fragmented social reality which is completely different from the physical? And can we just talk about cultural theories or gender theories or all kinds of post-structuralist tropes and topics without dealing with the fundamental nature of reality, which is both physical and non-physical? So these questions somehow were relegated to the margin, and there is a politics to it. I can come to the politics of it, but certainly there is a politics of relegating these questions to the margin. And I can point out that the origin of origin of overwhelming dominance of epistemology or epistemological inquiry over ontological questions has something to do with the cultural turn, has something to do with, even I would say, the Frankfurt School in Marxism and all. We can come to these questions, but just to point out that there is a politics to it. Now, coming to the basics of what a talk is all about. The talk is about the relationship between social and physical, the relationship between ontology and epistemology in the light of something called the quantum turn. Now, you might ask, what is this quantum turn? We haven't come across this word quantum. Why are you bringing these things? I mean, this is all physics, isn't it? Uh, but let me clarify this, that this is important. Why? Because social science always had some bit of love and hate relationship with physical sciences. Sometimes there was a deep aversion, and sometimes there was a close relationship. For instance, if I talk about specifically, if I talk about a very important corpus within social theory, which is Marxist theory, you all must be familiar with Marxism and Marxist theory. We all know that Marxism is about, the general impression of Marxism is that Marxism is about economics, Marxism is about political economy, Marxism is about, of course, we read Marx in sociology also, we read Marx in political science. There is a Marxist economics, development economics has a Marxist undertone to it. So, but we don't ask the fundamental question that is there any relationship with is there any relationship between Marxism and natural sciences? What is the relationship? Is there any historical connect? uh, I would say there has been a deep historical connection between Marxian Marxism and natural sciences. In fact, if you read, many of very few people are aware of this, that Marx's own PhD thesis was a philosophical reflection on the ontological question, on the between ontological comparison between philosopher Democritus and Epicurus. It was a philosophical work. It was not a conventional economic work. So we know this. Now, where has this thing become so prominent that Marxist social theory is all about the question of economics? And it's not, it's delinked completely. When did it happen that it got completely delinked with something called the natural sciences, something called what is happening in the domain of nature? Or when did, to put it simply, when did this happen, that dialectics, which is the fundamental method of Marxian philosophy, when did it got completely disentangled from the domain of physical and natural? I would say that this got completely disentangled with after something called Western Marxism. Now, I'm not saying that Western Marxism is responsible for this disentangling between physical and social. There are other reasons for it. But this was just an example to substantiate my point that all these social theories, all these economic theories that we consider to be conventional classical theories in sociology or in political science, have a deep connection, or had a deep connection with the question of the physical and the question of the natural, including Weber's theory, including Marxian theory, others, etc. But only with the something called the post-structuralist skepticism towards natural sciences, postmodernist cynicism towards anything which deals with the question of physics and the question of the methodology of sciences, that we, we see these domains as completely different. Now, my project, or I would say my aim in this talk, is to completely somehow to debunk this, I would say this problematic dimension of delinking social from the physical. And I'm going to do it through a turn which has recently got some traction, which is quantum turn. Before explaining what this quantum turn is, it's become extremely important to highlight what is this quantum all about. Now, quantum could mean multiple things in some way, but to be very precise, quantum mechanics or quantum physics had its origin in 1930s, with the founders being Max Planck, Schrödinger. Different physicists were the founding fathers of quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics was a very important watershed event in the history of physics. Why? Because it challenged the conventional deterministic and reductionistic domain of Newtonian physics. Like, if somebody is aware of the history of physics, then some of the students might be knowing about this, that physics has evolved. Modern physics has evolved. I'm not talking about the classical ancient physics, but I'm talking about the modern physics. Modern physics has evolved it started from Newtonian physics, which has a certain philosophy. I mean, please remember that these physicists we study, in physics department, Newton, Leibniz, they were all philosophers also. So they had a philosophy. Their physics was rooted in some philosophy. The philosophical roots of Newtonian physics was about determinism, was about certainty, was about something called reductionism and was about regularity. So these were the fundamental tropes of Newtonian physics. Then came something called relativity, Einstein's theory of relativity, general theory, special theory. That somehow changed the mode of Newtonian physics and made it more open in some way or the other, made it less reductionist in some way or the other, but still was not open enough to accommodate the questions of uncertainty, to accommodate the question of context, to accommodate the question of uh, in some way or the other, the question of materiality, or to put it very bluntly, to accommodate the question of consciousness. That is it the case that consciousness might have something to do with physics? Einsteinian physics was still not that accommodative. Then came a revolution in the domain of physics, which we now are very familiar with. In fact, contemporary physics cannot be understood without without the lens of quantum mechanics. That revolution was the revolution of quantum physics, which supplanted, which did not completely superseded, but which rather transcended the limitations of Newtonian and Einsteinian relativity, and argued that perhaps quantum world, and to put it very simply, quantum world is the world of subatomic particles. Like we know that classical physics deals with something called the bigger particles, the larger particles, and quantum physics deals with the subatomic particles. What is happening at the very basic level of reality. And it became and it showed a very different world. All these founding figures in quantum physics were perplexed. In fact, Einstein, to be very to put it very simply, Einstein completely rejected quantum mechanics. In fact, because quantum mechanics, Einstein thought, was all about indeterminacy, was all about uncertainty, was all about context. He said that it's bizarre, and he gave this famous aphorism, which became really popular in history and philosophy of science, which is called that God does not play dice. I mean, quantum mechanics is telling us that reality is all uncertain. Reality is all about indeterminacy. There can never be any certainty about measurement, any certainty about any physical entity, or about the position, about the momentum, etc., etc. So he said that God does not play dice. This is bizarre. But now we know that Einstein was wrong, and quantum mechanics is the method, or is the domain of science that gives you the precise understanding of what reality is at the subatomic level. Now, it gives you a very precise understanding about what is happening at the subatomic level. But does it has anything to do with the macro question, macro objects? Does it have anything to do with the question of how society functions? Because we know that society is not composed, of course, when we go into the philosophy of social science, we come across this debate between methodological individualism and holism. And we know that jury is still out. People still discuss this in fundamental uh, these fundamental questions in the paper dealing with methods and methodologies of social sciences. That is social reality composed of atomistic individuals, or shall we be starting with the whole? And most of the social scientists, they prefer holism over methodological individualism. They say that no, we should consider society as a whole, and we cannot reduce society to its constitutive parts. Although they might say that yes, society is constitutive of individuals, but reductionism they don't accept, especially postmodernist, post-structuralist. But the question is that if they don't accept reductionism, then uh, will they be open to accepting quantum model? Because quantum model is also not about reductionism, it's also about holism. And before going into the question of holism, let me clarify, let me go back to this fundamental point that quantum mechanics, as I told you, that's about subatomic reality. But is it also about macro reality? Is it also does it have something to do with social reality? Till some decades ago, this question was this was not even a question. Why? Because this was very clear that there is quantum reality, and quantum reality deals with subatomic particles, and we humans are not subatomic particles. We are constitutive of subatomic particles. We are constitutive of neurons, atoms, and cells, but we are not atoms. And quantum uncertainty, quantum contextuality, quantum indeterminacy, quantum non-locality, all these fashionable quantum tropes, they are viable, but they are viable only in the quantum sense, only at the subatomic level. But they fizzles out. They fizzle out. There is something called quantum decoherence. So don't be bothered about these terms. I'll explain these terms. There is something called quantum decoherence, which means that quantum phenomena is real, but it is real in the subatomic level. And the moment you move away from the subatomic to the macro level, it fizzles out. It gets weakened up. So this was the conventional understanding, but something happened in early 2000, or something happened in the domain of physics also, which has again, which has also created a lot of ripples. I mean, I won't say that it's still a watershed even, but it's a watershed thing, but it has created some bit of ripples. And now many physicists are arguing that the boundary between quantum and macro, or the boundary between where does quantum effects are real, where does quantum effects exist in the subatomic level, and where do they fizzle out at the macro level, is actually not very clear. And perhaps there is a possibility that quantum effects that deals with indeterminacy, non-locality, contextuality, etc., uncertainty, also might be applicable at a macro level. And perhaps we are, as individuals, as humans, as agents, are also not classical agents, which means we are also not classical objects being determined by the laws of classical Newtonian physics. Rather, there is a possibility that we might also be quantum objects or quantum individuals, which means we might be having something called quantum mind or quantum brain. And this is what is called quantum mind hypothesis or quantum brain hypothesis. That our mind or our brain, and I'm using the term interchangeably, although there is a difference, that that's the fundamental question again, but I'm using it interchangeably. I can come to this question again. Quantum mind argues that our mind or brain is not like classical computer. Some of you might be knowing what classical computers are. Classical computers deals with binary logic. They deal with algorithms like 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1, and they deals with, I mean, their constitution is fundamentally rooted in binary logic. And going by the idea of classical computers and the idea of our brain or mind being like classical computer, perhaps there is no possibility or very little room for our consciousness to be real. For our consciousness to be real, I'll explain this. You might have heard this thing that, I mean, this is very commonsensical. People say this, that, oh, our brain is computer. We are computers, we are machines. And this machine metaphor is very common in positivistic sciences or in positivistic social sciences also. And what does this machine metaphor entails? What does it entails? It entails this idea that there is a correspondence between our brain and computers. Our brains are like computers, classical computers, and we deal with things in a binary logic. This hypothesis, I'm calling this hypothesis, not real science, because this was also an assumption which was taken very seriously because of the lack of the opposition. This hypothesis has been challenged by quantum mind hypothesis, that no, our brain is not like classical computer. Our brain or our mind is like quantum computer. When I say quantum computer, then perhaps the idea is that our brain or mind does not obey the law of classical physics, rather it obeys the law of quantum mechanics. And what are the laws? What are the constitutive elements of quantum physics? It's all about uncertainty, it's all about contextuality, it's all about indeterminacy, it's all about non-locality, it's about entanglement. Now, what is entanglement? Entanglement means that particles are entangled with one another irrespective of the spatio-temporal context. I mean, context is important irrespective of the spatio-temporal domains. Like particles can be at two different spatial zones and still there can be interactions between particles, isn't it? That's what non-locality is. Now, if this is what reality is and our mind or brain is also quantum, this has implications. This has tremendous implications on the question of how shall we theorize social, how shall we theorize the question of free will, and how shall we theorize the problem of determinism, and how shall we theorize the question of agency. So this is the background. Now, to be to come to be to come to the question of what quantum mind is and what are the implications, I am let me come with two important texts that are really important, and you those of you who are interested probably can read some of the reviews, can see some of the lectures that is responsible for this quantum turn. I'm calling it turn, although one can certainly debate that there is no turn, you are just using this term, but many theoreticians, many philosophers are seriously engaging with it. That's why I'm calling it a turn. Two important texts in this domain of quantum turn and the in the light of quantum mind and all these things. One important text, first text, is the text written by Karen Berard. Karen Berard. Karen Berard is a feminist scholar, philosopher of science. She has written this very important text called Meeting the Universe Halfway, Quantum Mechanics and the Entanglement of Matter and Meaning. So this is the first text. The second important text in this domain of quantum social theory or quantum philosophy of social science is, I would call it, the magnum opus in this field, and that is by Alexander Wendt. It's called Quantum Mind and Social Sciences, Unifying Physical and Social Ontology. And this talk is about these two texts and what are the limitations of these texts and how these texts are challenging something really fundamental and why these texts are really, really crucial for social scientists to read. Now, let me start with the, Wendt's text. Wendt's text is all about this thing that we have been discussing, that I've discussed till now, that it takes this idea of quantum mind very seriously. It takes this idea of quantum mind literally, not metaphorically. Please remember, many of the philosophers or lay philosophers, I would say, they use these terms like quantum healing and these things, but they use it metaphorically. Like there is a popular text written by Deepak Chopra called Quantum Healing. But Deepak Chopra uses the word quantum more metaphorically, although he also delves, sometimes he engages with the question of quantum physics, but not at a very deep level. But Wendt is using the word quantum not metaphorically, not figuratively, rather literally, and is proposing his theory of social science, grounding it on something called quantum brain hypothesis. Now, what this quantum brain hypothesis is, I've already explained. Who are the founding figures? Who are the people involved in this hypothesis? Let me tell you the names. The important figure is Sir Roger Penrose. Roger Penrose is a physicist. He's a Nobel laureate who wrote this very important text that became very crucial text in the consciousness studies. It's called Emperor's New Mind. And in 2022, he got Nobel Prize, not for quantum mind hypothesis, but for some other idea of in physics. But he's really a very sharp thinker. And he proposed this idea in 70s, or I think in 74 or 80s, that, and the idea was in this text called Emperor's New Mind, that perhaps consciousness is non-computable. Consciousness is non-computable. Now, what does it mean that consciousness is non-computable? He proposed this idea that consciousness cannot be something which can be reduced or which can be, I would say, which can be computationally explain. Or to put it more simply, the crux of his idea was that there is a difference between computability and understanding. There is a fundamental difference between computability and understanding. And consciousness is not about computability, rather, it's about understanding. Now, this has enormous implications for social sciences because we know, I mean, in CPS, there's very famous, uh, text written by Professor, Mahajan, Explanations and Understanding in Human Sciences. Many of you might have read this. What is it all about? The idea is that explanation deals with explanation is more about natural sciences, and social science is about understanding. The whole hermeneutic turn and cultural turn is all about but many, very few are aware that perhaps even physicists have been talking about this thing since 1980s, and it is gaining a lot of traction now. Now, this was his idea that consciousness cannot be computed, and he was trying to base this idea on something called, uh, now again, don't be bothered about these terms, but something called Gödel's incompleteness theorem. Now, Kurt Gödel was a mathematician, mathematical logician, also a very important figure in the school of logical positivism. Now, doesn't mean, I mean, this is very, I mean, this is very paradoxical in some way. Kurt's Gödel's incompleteness theorem is being used by Sir Roger Penrose to debunk the foundations of positivism. But Kurt Gödel himself was an important figure in logical positivist school. But this is what things are. So his idea is that Gödel's incompleteness theorem uh, proves that no system of thought is complete in some way or the other, and consciousness perhaps is also not is incomplete, and this makes it non-computable. Without going into the fundamental question of mathematical logic into it, because it will take a lot of time, the idea is, to put it very simply, the idea is that consciousness, or something to do consciousness. Now, what is consciousness? The idea that what is it like to be Varun? What is it like to be Jigyasa? The fundamental feeling of I, the fundamental phenomenal feeling, subjective feeling, cannot be reduced to computationality, cannot be computed. This was the idea proposed by Roger Penrose. And this idea was taken very seriously by a biologist, anesthesiologist named Stuart Hameroff, who argued that perhaps, uh, consciousness is non-computable and it's not like classical computer, but perhaps consciousness is like quantum computer, because quantum computer is non-binary. Quantum quantum realm is not about non-dualities and non-binaries. And he argued that perhaps there is something called some domain within our neuronal structure, in which perhaps quantum computationality might be actualizing. Might I mean, to put it very simply, there is some structure within our brain in which uh, which might be playing the role of the quantum computer. And that structure he proposed is something called microtubules in neuron. This is biology, but then still very crucial to understand this point, that microtubules, according to Stuart Hameroff, is that place in the brain which in which quantum computation happens. And when quantum computation happens, then certainly our brain is quantum mind. And Roger Penrose, surprisingly and interestingly, Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff collaborated. Physicists and biologists collaborated, and they proposed this theory called orchestrated objective reduction theory, which is nothing but this idea that our brain is not classical computer, but rather is quantum computer, and follows the laws of not the laws of classical physics, but follows the laws of quantum physics. Now, Wendt, coming back to the basic text that we started with, Wendt is building his theory of quantum social theory on this hypothesis called quantum brain hypothesis, basing his idea on the philosophy and the theory of quantum mind. And he is starting with this question that what if we are walking wave functions? What if we are walking wave function? Now, what are wave functions? Wave functions are mathematical probabilities of finding, it's a mathematical probability of finding a particle in a certain still zone. To put very simply, wave functions are, it's about whether we are quantum species or not, to put it very simply. And he's trying to argue that what if we are walking wave functions, and what if we are quantum individuals? What if we are not classical individuals? And then he's trying to argue that why this question is important in social sciences, because according to him, according to him, he categorizes two social scientists into two groups, which we are very familiar with. One is positivist, and the other one are interpretivist. So one can certainly question that this categorization is very vague and it's very simplistic, but still, let's try to understand it. So positivistic social science we are very familiar with, which tries to draw sociology and social sciences along the lines of physics. We know logical positivistic school, positivism school. We know logical empiricism. We know Auguste Comte. We know Durkheim. They were all positivist. So he would say that positivist would certainly draw on physics, but they draw on classical physics. But then he comes to interpretivist, and interpretivist includes all kinds of social scientists which are very sort of in the dominating position, we know, including the cultural theorists, feminist school, post-structuralist, and some kind of Marxist theoreticians are also certainly interpretivist. They would certainly, according to Wendt, would have problem with something called we being physically rooted, or social being physically rooted, or social having an entanglement with physical. Because remember, again, I'm repeating this point, post-structuralism always had some bit of, not some bit, huge problem with positivism. It came as a response to positivism, and it certainly challenged this idea of trying to base social theory, cultural theory along the lines of physics. And to elaborate on this, because this is such an important point, some of you might be knowing about something called Sokal affairs. Sokal affairs. So Sokal affair is. I'll come to the main point, but this is important. Sokal affair was a very interesting event in the history of post-structuralism. So there was, or there is, a physicist named Alan Sokal who teaches physics in New York State University, and he had serious issue with, post-structuralist understanding of, or post-structuralist misuse, what he called misuse of physics, and he. So to debunk post-structuralist or cultural theorist, agenda, he was calling it agenda, he had written a hoax paper on in this journal called Social Text. The title of the paper was Transgressing the Boundaries, something like Quantum Hermeneutics of Quantum Gravity. And surprisingly, it got published in a very reputed journal called Social Text, post-structuralist cultural theory journal. And later he revealed that he was using it to, it was a deceiving strategy, and it was a hoax article, just to show that post-structuralist or post-modernist, I'm using these terms interchangeably, we know that there is a difference, certainly, but postmodern cultural theory, according to Alan Sokal, is a sham. Because, see, they have published a hoax article without proper understanding that this is actually, this is all mumbo jumbo. This is, using fancy jargons from quantum and all. So he wanted to show that, see, this is misuse of science. And they are skeptical of science, but they misuse science and they use it very metaphorically. Now, I'm highlighting this affair or this event just to show the tussle that has been there historically between postmodernist, scholars driven by postmodern philosophy or methodology or whatever, and natural sciences. But according to Wendt, even post-modernist or post-structuralist or cultural theorist or those who give so much importance to language, even they would accept, uh, I mean, use this term that when they are drunk, that they would accept that, yeah, when they're conscious or when they're very aware, they would say, no, 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 we are not building, we are different. We are not connected to the physical. Social is autonomous, completely autonomous, independent, or there is something called agency of the social. But according to when they are like, when they are tipsy, when they are drunk, they would also acknowledge that yes, there has to be some connection between social and physical. We cannot be disembodied self, or we cannot be disembodied social entities. It's all also about embodiment. We are connected to some way or the other, to the material or to the physical, to the social. Now, according to Wendt, both of these, one explicitly, one implicitly, accepts that there is a social connection. There is a connection, entanglement between social and physical. But very few would dare to go into the question of how are they connected. That is the domain of philosophy of science. But very few social theorists would dare to go into the domains of philosophy of science or philosophy of social science. Perhaps some exceptions are there. Douglas Porpora and many others are, some of them are there, but very few in the conventional social sciences. Now, according to Wendt, uh, both of them, positivist as well as interpretivist, accept one explicitly and one implicitly, something called the causal closure of physics. Now, what is this thing called causal closure of physics? Causal closure of physics is nothing but physicalism or materialism, that our natural environment or our physical environment is causally closed. Causally closed means that anything which is social in some way or the other is also physical, also material. And that has implications. Why? Because imagine, I'll give you one example. uh, take the take the anthropological studies of esoteric phenomenon, stuff dealing with magic. Very few anthropologists, they study esoteric, they study magic, they study spirituality, but very few of them amongst them would argue that whatever these experiences that the subject is trying to narrate is real in the real sense. They would say that it's a social construct. They would say that these mediums, these supposedly extrasensory perceptions are social construct, or they are, I mean, in some way or the other, they are construct. They are not real. They would not accept the ontological reality of these things. Why? Because it transgresses the conventional paradigm which Wendt is calling causal closure of physics, which is nothing but materialism and physicalism. That how can ghosts be real? Now, I'm not saying ghosts are real. Don't put words in my mouth. I'm not saying ghosts are real or they're unreal. That's another question. But just to explain, just to illustrate the point, very few would say no, no, no. Of course, they would say yes, ghosts are very important, but important in sociological sense, important in some way, or social psychological sense, or they give meaning. They have a role to play. So they use it very instrumentally in some way or the other. Why? Because according to Wendt, uh, again, they are also bounded, or they're also their ideas are also constrained by this causal closure of physics, which is physicalism. But now, according to Wendt, this causal closure of physics has been challenged within physics, according to Wendt. But there is no cognizance, or very little cognizance of that challenge in social sciences or in philosophy of social sciences. Now, that challenge is coming from quantum. And according to Wendt, that challenge is that challenge to materialism, reductionist materialism. Now, what is the alternative that is coming from Wendt? If causal closure of physics coming from classical physics, which is materialistic, physicalistic, what is the alternative that is coming from quantum mechanics? The interpretation of quantum mechanics espoused by Alexander Wendt. That is nothing but something called panpsychism. Now, what is panpsychism? The idea that consciousness is not epiphenomenon. It's not epiphenomena, which means it's not like a secretion from your brain. Rather, it is primary entity of the universe, rooted in every material reality. It's not idealism also. Remember, idealism argues that consciousness is primary, materialism argues that matter is primary. Panpsychism argues that each bit of matter has some bit of consciousness to it. And it's a very classical idea, but it has gained a lot of prominence in philosophy of mind and consciousness studies of late, recently. So now it has been taken very seriously. And Wendt is proposing this idea that perhaps there is panpsychism is true, and the mechanism of panpsychism to be true is through quantum mind hypothesis. And if it is true, then what are the implications? The implications become very obvious. That certainly we have free will. Now you might say that, of course, in social science we know that we have free will, but that is a very folk understanding of free will. That is not rooted in any ontology. Again, coming to the basic point that social sciences, because of its affliction that we try to reduce everything to epistemology, we have ignored the ontological ground of free will. And Wendt is providing one with the ontological ground to actually substantiate the point that yes, we are free, we have something called agency, and we are not just rational actors behaving rationally, or it's an illusory rationality. Rather, it's a real rationality rooted in certain ground. Also, it gives you it changes the very domain of the question between agency and free will, agency and structure. So structures are certainly there, but structures are also real. Structures are also real. And structures can be challenged through agency, because agency is real, free will is real. Now, in classical model, remember, and all the biologists, like for instance, Robert Sapolsky is a very, very prominent biologist in contemporary times. He argues that free will is an illusion. Daniel Dennett, another important philosopher of mind, argued that free will is an illusion. And we take in social science free will for, in some way or the other, take it for granted. Although different kinds of social sciences are there. Forgive me if I'm trying to club different domains into one. But there is, social science cannot happen if we do not have free will, isn't it? But we don't bother to go into the ontological ground of where is it coming from, how it is being drawn from the physical. This ontological ground is presented to us by Alexander Wendt, and that is the achievement in some way or the other of this text. Now, what are the other implications? The other implications is that it also gives you a mechanism to explain how holism works, how society as a holistic reality works. So it has implications for in, again, philosophy of social science, that it lays framework or a ground, ontological ground, to understand or to sort of provide you a mechanism of how holism is true. Because we talk about holism, but we again don't propound on the ontological ground. So holism, free will, the question of agency and structure, and the question of something called we are entangled species. This is very important, that we are relational beings. So the idea or the myth of we being individualistic, atomized individuals existing completely independent of the other, and whatever relationship we have is a social coming from social norms only, that has been challenged. Because remember, according to Wendt, we are quantum species, we are quantum minds, and as fundamental particles are entangled, quantum minds are also entangled. So he gives this idea of relationality, he gives this idea of entanglement, his philosophy or his idea. And he also gives us a very important framework to understand social reality, which is holographic framework. Now, what is a hologram? Some of you might be knowing a hologram is this thing in which information encoded in the whole is also there in the pixels. Whole is there in the pixel, and pixel is there in the whole. So the whole is there in the individual, and individual is there in the whole. So this is holographic model is the outcome of Alexander Wendt's philosophy. And this holographic model of society, again, is very non-conventional, that a part of you lives, I am the part of society and society is part of me. Now, still many people say that why do we need to go into the quantum? We know this is pretty obvious. We need to go into the quantum because we do not have an ontological ground. And in the light of the attacks that social science face from positivistic sciences, we need to have a ground. This is what my point is. So there are tremendous implications on the question of agency, on the question of structure, on the question of consciousness, on the question of free will, and on the question of relationality, entanglement, and holism and holographic model of society. So this is the fundamental implications. Now, coming to the second text, which is again a very seminal text within something called quantum turn. The second text is uh, the text, although this second text is actually written earlier. So Alexander Wendt's text was written in 2015, and Karen Barat's work is slightly old. It was written in 2007. Karen Barat is a feminist scholar. She argues that we need some, again, she argues that we also, along the lines of Wendt, that we need some bit of ontological ground. Although Karen Barat calls it onto-epistemology, remember. So the difference is that Wendt is calling it ontology, rather Karen Barat is calling it onto-epistemology. She is the one who coined the term onto-epistemology. Now, onto-epistemology is this idea that ontology and epistemologies are not different, or to put it very simply, very succinctly, is this, that subject and objects are not different. Subject and objects are not different. Object is also subject is also object. So Karen Barad is trying to argue, again, she is also trying to argue something along the grounds of relationality, that we are also relational species. And she's arguing that uh, she's given this term called intra-action. Now, what is intra-action? Intra-action is different from interaction. When we talk about interaction between individuals and that giving rise to society, we argue that interaction entails or encompasses this idea that we are individual entities existing before the relationship, or relata exist before relation. She challenges that. She argues that individual entities actually do not exist before the relationship is foregrounded. So it's the relationality that gives rise to the actants rather than the other way around. So she again challenges the idea of individual atomized beings existing independent of the relationality. So she again gives the primacy of relationality. And we know that how important relationality is for any frame of feminist politics or progressive politics. So please remember, these ideas also have implications in conventional politics. These are not all, of course, it's abstract, but it's all about rational abstraction and lived abstraction. There are different kinds of abstraction, remember. It's about lived abstraction also. So both Wendt and Karen Barat's ideas of interaction, agency. Karen Barat talks about agential realism, which is this that agency is real. And she also argues that matter is active, matter is vibrant. And this is very similar to what panpsychism is all about, that matter is not dead. Now, if some of you might have read, not some of you, all of you have read Hobbes, isn't it? Now, when we read Hobbes, what is the conventional understanding of Hobbes we have? That Hobbes talks about dead matter. We also, in Hobbes, perhaps there is very little space for free will and illusion. Free will is, although Hobbes himself never explicitly talked about free will as an illusion, but the implications are very clear. But so the materialism of Hobbes is mechanical. Materialism of Marx is dialectical. But materialism of Karen Barat, and perhaps I'm calling it materialism, but not reductive materialism. So remember, there are different forms of materialism. So these theoreticians are challenging conventional materialism, which is the problematic one, according to them. The other form of physicalism, which they are espousing, is vibrant materialism or new materialism or active materialism, in which matter is not inert. Matter is not brute, inert, dead matter. Rather, matter is active. And each and everything are entangled in some way or the other. Object subject entanglement, nature culture entanglement, subjectivity, objectivity entanglement, human environment entanglement. Now, if we take these ideas seriously, it has tremendous implications on the questions of political ecology. In fact, you cannot do progressive political ecology without taking cognizance of these ideas. Why? Because what is the fundamental problem of Anthropocene? I'm not digressing. This might sound a digression, but this is not digression actually. What is the fundamental problem of Anthropocene? The fundamental problem of Anthropocene is it, how, philosopher Akil Bilgrami puts it, it, you know, it shows you that there is no nature. Rather, it's all about natural resource. Like what Bilgrami says, that when did or how did this idea of nature gets transformed into the idea of natural resource? Why? Why we don't talk about nature in itself? Why? Because nature in the classical Newtonian conception, which has implications on social theory, is dead nature, is dead matter. So it, in the classical physics, can provide us some ground to do what is called shallow ecology, but can provide no ground for us to do deep ecology or progressive political ecology, which we need, because it perceives matter or nature to be dead and fundamentally different from humans. And uh, this ground, ontological ground, is very interestingly being provided by these two thinkers. So now I've shown that these have implications on the question of political ecology also. Now, how much time do I have, Jigyasa?
It is already 5. You do not have much time, but we'd like you to continue and finish the point that you're trying to make.
Okay, so okay, just 5 minutes, 5 more minutes. So yeah, so both Karen Berard and Wentz scholarship is important because they are, first of all, they are providing ontological ground to some of the supposedly epistemological questions. Secondly, it provides a very strong ground to do political ecology. Like, for instance, to put it very just to make it very clear, just to show that there is a very important article written recently by a scholar named Nora Bowman. A brilliant article. Some of you are interested, I can share that. She has tried to connect Wendt's idea and Barat's idea with the Canadian indigenous struggles, aboriginal struggle. She's trying to argue that, why Canadian colonial settler, she calls it colonial settler colonialism because white people settled there. Why do they never take the testimonies of the indigenous Inuits and aboriginal people very seriously? Because there is a fundamental difference in their ontology. And quantum ontology, according to that author, if we take the prism of quantum ontology, then we will take, or we have to take, all these realities and all these suppositions about realities coming from the indigenous groups very seriously. To put it differently, what is she trying to argue? What Timothy Morton, the famous dark ecologist and ecologist, political ecologist, argues, that ontological questions are political questions. Politics is not just about epistemology. Ontological questions are political questions. If I'm not taking your ontological reality seriously, then I'm not taking you seriously, your philosophy seriously. So Canadian settlers never take the testimonies of these indigenous people about mountains, about rivers very seriously. They take it metaphorically. They say that rivers are alive, and they say, yeah, rivers are alive. We know that because this is your cultural thing. So they reduce their ontological reality to culture. And there is a binary dualistic logic embedded in it that culture is different from nature, which we know has been questioned by these people and also been questioned by other conventional, not conventional, but philosophers of science like Bruno Latour. I mean, there are other ways of doing this kind of theory, not just from the quantum, but Bruno Latour and others are doing without quantum. But quantum can also be an ally. So I'll conclude by saying this, that quantum can also be an ally in doing a progressive critical theory. This is Wendt's point also, that quantum can be an ally to critical theory, and resistance to quantum is one thing, but quantum can also be an ally, and quantum can also be a resistance to the conventional classical model, which is deterministic and reductionistic, and which is exploitative, which gives ground for all these exploitations. So I conclude here, and if there are any questions, I'm open to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Varun. Thank you so much. A lot to unpack. In fact, in the last 1 hour or so, little less than an hour, perhaps we started around 4:15, so 45 minutes that you've spoken to us. You've given us so many concepts, which I, in hindsight, had the time and the energy and also the motivation as the discussant to go through and to read upon. But I have a feeling that for anybody who's joined this discussion for the first time and hasn't really had the chance to think about stuff like panpsychism, or what are these terms in physics, will probably have to go back and look at some of these things again to make sense of the entirety of it. So with that caveat, because I think I have been working on this for last 2 days, 2-3 days, and even I haven't been able to make sense of a whole lot of it right away. So with that level of self-vulnerable announcement, let me pose some of the questions or some of the concerns that I had after I kind of made sense of what you were trying to say. And of course, I've had the opportunity of listening to you at other occasions because we're batchmates, and in some ways we've also come to you with respect to some of the work that I have done on effect and emotion. So that with that familiarity also, I'd like to pose certain questions. I want to open up सबसे पहले the conversation around agency, because I think free will and agency is something that you're saying that there's a certain way in which quantum mind, or just looking at quantum as a useful tool for social ontology, that free will and agency is something that can help us here. I was wondering, and Margaret Pernow's work on medieval Muslims and history and memory was coming to me, and she says something very beautiful when she's talking about the idea of ghosts, which you also referred to very interestingly, saying, well, perhaps the idea is relevant for social anthropology, social psychology, perhaps also affect and emotion, but not so much when we come to the physical reality of it. And then what she says then is that when she was interviewing people, they mostly referred to the idea of memory, not in the active sense of how an agent would say, where one says, "Main yaad karta hoon," and I remember. Instead, they would say, and she would translate from that, they would say, "Mujhe yaad aata hai," right? It comes to me, as opposed to I bring it. So I was wondering, within that space of, non-locality, right? And I'm trying to now jump to, say, the idea of light. The fact that the sun rays have started several, light years ago, and they reach us here. So there is a non-locality in which, in the way that you're talking about quantum also, particles, subatomic particles, or reality, which is manifest not in the not in the immediate sense, but non-locality, where very distant phenomena can have instantaneous implications or manifestations. So how do we reconcile the question of time and the question of agency, especially with respect to non-locality? Now, the reason that I'm asking this question is because the method seems absolutely brilliant if we were to think in terms of some micro, say, conversations. And I think not just you, but this entire work in quantum mind perhaps would then collapse into metaphor, which a lot of other scholars that you mentioned too have been doing. But how do we propose, if we were to bring this into our empirical world, if we were to bring this into our subjective world, if we were to talk about quantum as a method, so is it something that can help us again in understanding one? And can this understanding be preemptive, which is what my second question is. So the biggest claim to fame of the positivist or the materialist is, we can tell you, we can predict for you, right? If you give us the parameters, we'll tell you in under X circumstances Y happens. So under variables A, B, C, you will reach M, right? And therefore, there's a certain way in which both politics, which is the power, and the idea of society, feels drawn to, or has been drawn to the. In fact, scholars have been drawn to the idea of positivism in some form or the other, is because there is a certain way in which predictability is promised. So if you have the right variables, you will have the solution or the consequence would come right away. What I'm hearing you say, and what I'm hearing through you, I'm hearing Wendt say, and those of us who'd like to make a case for, quantum mind, I'm hearing you people say as well, there are multiple possibilities, and there would be a manifest conscious space which will then arrest, for the lack of better word, the direction that will then only manifest itself. It will become apparent, manifest in the moment of consciousness. Now, what I'm hearing you say, oh, we don't know. That's what I'm hearing you say. Anything can happen. We don't know. There are multiple possibilities. We're entangled. We're constantly, the subject and the object are both quantum in their physicality and in their consciousness. And we don't necessarily know. So then are we saying this is a method that helps you understand, perhaps either as an afterthought or in the moment of the wave complex, the wave function complex or collapse? Or is it something that we're trying to also build a theory of prediction, or that we're saying, no, it isn't really, it's a bad goal. We should have never tried to be predictive in our knowledge. Is that the kind of conversation we're trying to do? Because what I'm hearing you say is that agency does not exist. It's entangled, it's correlated, it's intra, up until the point that it becomes manifest. However, it was always there. It only manifests at the point of collapse. So it's a very interesting, of course, I'm not very sure if I've understood it correct, but if this is how we're working, then are we also suggesting that this is a process of understanding and not a process that can help us, say, predict or control or say anything in terms of all causal relations then lead to the positivist claim or the material claim that we've had so far? So that's my second kind of question to you. I'm sorry, because your talk was full of ideas and your papers are full of ideas. So I have more to ask, which then comes my third problem, which interestingly you did not say nothing about in the talk, but I know that you work on that side as well. And perhaps the answers to these questions would come in there, which is the absence of engagement with, say, spiritual philosophical schools of thought, which may be located in religion. Say Buddhism has some idea. In fact, I think in the way that we understand some kind of spiritual philosophical, quote unquote, Hinduism also has some idea about how to make sense of the whole idea of time being, a quantum thing. So is there a possibility? Are we trying to take this work in that direction? And if we are, then how do we protect this work from, getting into a space where it becomes, an easy available tool for post-truth society, which then becomes a difficult kind of, crisis where how do we disable the possibility of this speculative, mysticism being, for the lack of better word, co-opted by projects which may not be interested in, interrelations or peaceful, harmonious living relations, and instead are projects which are very different. So arresting this, so my truth above everybody else's truth means we have multiple truths, and then, you can go ahead and complicate the idea of truth so much that we don't know what is it that we're talking about. So how does one stop the quantum explanation from being used for such a project? So I have many more questions, but what I'm going to do is leave you with these three, because there's a lot to unpack here. I would request that do you want to take a number of questions beforehand, and then
can I answer your questions first, because these are really important? Yeah. Thank you so much, Jigyasa. Sorry.
Yeah. So what we do is you answer. I mean, let's try and think in terms of responding to some of the things that I've said as a discussant. And I feel slightly, in a tricky position for being both the organizer and the discussant, and now also the moderator. So I'm sorry I'm taking precedence here because I'm the discussant, known discussant. But what we do is we request Dr. Wighmal to answer respond to some of the things I've said, and then we'll open up the session for questions from the participants and audiences. Okay, Varun. Yeah.
So thank you so much, Jigyasa, for these really, really important questions. I mean, there are three questions, if I'm correct. First question is about predictability. That there is a tremendous possibility in terms of. I mean, it opens a plethora of possibilities, isn't it? Quantum realm opens a plethora of potentialities and all. I would say that this is the advantage that quantum modeling has. So I did not discuss this due to the paucity of time, but there are other thinkers working along these lines. Like I would say many. In fact, there is a domain which has started recently: quantum social science, quantum economics. There is something called quantum decision theory, quantum game theory. All these models are gaining a lot of traction, and they are actually doing what you are trying to point out. They are actually trying to understand why our conventional economic models are failure. Why do they fail? Why we can never predict recession, or we are always wrong, economists are always wrong, though we know that we have a Marxist explanation for that, but then that is not enough, at least as far as my understanding is concerned. And quantum like modeling, so there is a domain called quantum like modeling in economics, quantum like modeling in development economics also, so which is all about applying these models of quantum cognition, not uh, there was some disturbance. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I think
No.
somebody was unmuted. I've been
No problem, no problem, no problem, no problem. So the idea is that quantum-like modeling, which is based on this concept of quantum cognition, which, remember, Jigyasa, is not about quantum mind, actually. It's just about, like, for instance, I'll give you this example of two scholars working on this area, two or three scholars. One is Busemeyer, and then there's another one, Indian scholar, very important work he's doing, Sudeep Patra. He teaches in OP Jindal University, and he he's doing great work in some way or the other. That he's trying to again frame quantum-like models using not the quantum mind hypothesis, rather the principles of quantum mechanics to predict economics, to predict the possibilities that might happen in the future. So it has a predictability component to it, not through quantum mind, but through quantum-like modeling and quantum-like cognition, which is applying quantum uncertainty, indeterminacy, non-predictability, contextuality. Primarily, context is very important to understand economic reality. So I don't know whether this answers your question, but I would say that quantum has application on this front also. Not quantum mind, but quantum like modeling. Second question is really interesting. If I got it correctly, that you have beautifully enunciated this point that agency, the Karen Barat's point, that agency perhaps is not real, but it gets real only when there is a relational angle to it. And now your question, if I'm not wrong, is what are the implications? The implications is that agency of an atomized individual perhaps is not real. The moment we see us as atomized individual in the classical fashion, then perhaps it's illusory. But what if we start perceiving ourselves and social reality not through the atomized model, rather than through holographic model, rather than through this model of agency being relational? Then that would have implications. Now, again, this might sound abstract. You would say that social reality is very complex, very puzzling, and a more, I would say, a more conventional sociologists would debunk this, and they say that no, 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 this is not the way to do social sciences. And but trust me, there are so many limitations to the conventional sociological models also. So why there is this skepticism or sometimes cynicism to engage with ontological questions? This is the fundamental problem that I have, because fragmented knowledge is not enough. Like, we are all dealing with, remember, Jigyasa, in the age of compartmentalization of knowledge, people, PhD scholars, forget about PhD scholars, even you know stalwarts, are completely unaware of what the other person is doing, and then there is no connect with the larger reality. If you are working on perhaps one area, you're working on perhaps some dimension of caste, some dimension of class, then you are just all the time engaging with that, and you have lost the plot of the larger picture, big picture. So these works are also important to, I would say, resuscitate the quest to explore the big picture, the quest to move beyond the compartmentalization of knowledge, which, remember, is also a modernist project. Compartmentalization of knowledge is a modernist project, we know that. Specialization, I'm not against specialization, this is also amounts to specialization, but not connecting the dots is also what, in some way or the other, the modern agenda is, because we want specialists to work for the industry rather than contemplative thinkers trying to connect the dots. So there is a politics to it. So I would say that this is a brilliant question, but I would say that the answer is that agency, if it's not real, then it's not real in the individualistic sense of the term. Rather, it's real in the relational sense. The third question, I just forgot. I mean, can you just repeat the third question? I'm so sorry. Or the last point that you, last question, or perhaps the last point that you were mentioning.
No, I think through predictability and agency were the two major
Two questions.
chunks.
Okay.
The chunks of what I was trying to say. And I think I had two questions with respect to agency, of its collapse and manifest, and then free will. So those two were connected.
So the free will thing is.
I also had a third set, wherein I said, how do we stop this conversation or this method to reach the post-truth and to that was my third concern.
Thank you. Yeah. So I mean, I am not very sure about this question, but I don't think that quantum framework is taking us towards post-truth. It's not relativistic in that sense. It's opening the ground for multiple possibilities without saying that everything goes is okay. Because post-truth is this idea that it questions the fundamental domain of objective knowledge. If I have 2 minutes, can I have 2 minutes? 1 minute or 2 minutes? Yeah. So the fundamental problem with post-truth is, Jigyasa, if I'm not wrong, is this thing that, which, in critical realist school jargon, it's called ontic fallacy. Sorry, epistemic fallacy, not ontic fallacy. It's epistemic fallacy, which means that you do not talk about reality out there. So whatever I'm thinking is reality. I am what all these superficial, aphorisms and, statements being popular that I am the reality or whatever. So post-truth emanates from that logic in which the whole ground of objective knowledge is being questioned. And that amounts to epistemic fallacy, which is a critical realist jargon coming from critical realism's framework of thinking, which is a school of philosophy, which means trying to reduce ontological questions to epistemological questions. And it is the culmination of that epistemic fallacy, or rather the apotheosis, the peak, the zenith of that. I don't think quantum turn is doing that. Quantum turn is, because remember, Wendt is also a member of critical realist school. He's not trying to engage in epistemic fallacies, rather he's trying to move beyond both epistemic and ontic fallacy. And ontic fallacy is just the opposite, when you completely reduce epistemology to ontology without taking into the context, without taking into the consideration the question of context. So he's trying to move beyond, both epistemic and ontic fallacy. And he's saying that, yes, there is an ontological objective knowledge, reality out there, but we should be very careful in acknowledging that reality. And we can have multiple modes of looking into that reality. And then we can use something called judgmental rationality, which is again a framework of critical realist school, to reach to that reality. Not that there is no reality. So it's not postmodernist, although postmodernists would hate me for this, but then whatever allegations that people have against postmodernism, it's about relativism. It's not at all about relativism. So I don't think, if the question was that does it lead to post-truth frames of thinking, I don't think so. Thank you.
Okay, Varun, thank you so much for those answers. I will now invite, request, or there is a message in the chat box. If you want to ask a question, you can always, raise your hand as Zoom allows. There's a question in the chat box. Do you have access to the chat box, Varun? Would you want me to read the message out
Yes,
loud?
yes, I have. Shall I read the question?
Yeah, please do. And then
Thank you so much.
And then after that, we'll go to Rahul and Ishan, but let Varun read this question first.
Yeah, thank you so much for this great session. Got so much stuff to, kindly type the names of the two researcher authors you mentioned. Okay, so the two authors are Alexander Wendt, and the title of their work, the magnum opus, is Quantum Mind and Social Science. Do you want me to? She wants me to type.
What I'm going to do is, we have the emails of the participants here. We'll probably circulate all the names that you mentioned today with respect to different readings that you were suggesting to the participants after. If that's all right.
Yeah.
But there are questions.
Yeah, so the question is that what do these researchers say about religion as the concepts like consciousness existing in matter, all beings are connected, etc.? Are they saying also found in old religious traditions like Jainism, Buddhism, and Vedanta? This is a very important question. Shekhar, although these authors, especially Wendt and Karen Berard, have not directly explicated on Eastern traditions, but you are right. One certainly can draw a strong link between Eastern knowledge tradition or tradition dealing with Eastern philosophies, like including Chinese philosophy, Indian philosophy, or any non-binary thinking. So, of course, one can certainly draw a strong connection between this quantum mode of thinking, quantum frame of thinking, and non-binary logic, non-binary domains of thinking, which Eastern tradition, remember, not all, but many of them talks about non-binary modes of thinking. For instance, although what does non-binary modes of thinking is also a fundamental question, a basic question, a very important, complex question. For instance, if you say Buddhism, uh, many good writings are now coming up on comparing quantum mind and work of Berard and went with the Madhyamika school of Buddhism, the school of Nagarjuna, the school of Chandrakirti, etc., etc. And they are drawing strong parallel. Considering Vedant, there are good write-ups on comparing Vedant with quantum mind. In fact, I would suggest you should go and read Sudeep Patra's very important article on something called Anekantvad or Sadhyavad in Jainism and quantum-like models. So Sudeep Patra's very interesting article in which he's juxtaposing a Sadhyavad or Anekantvad of Jain philosophy, which talks about contextuality and how it has strong parallel with quantum frames of thinking and quantum like modelings. So of course there are interesting works on that and one can explore that. But remember that whenever we talk about Eastern tradition, there is this attempt to unify it or bring uniformity into it and tend to ignore the diversity and plurality within the Eastern frame. So remember, Madhyamika school is very different from the Vedantic school, because Madhyamika school, I would say, more than Wendt-like framework, it overlaps with the phenomenological framework because it is anti-metaphysical, remember. But Vedant is metaphysically rooted. But still one can draw strong connections. So, but with the caveat that there is no one Eastern frame of thinking. There is a tremendous amount of diversity within what is called the Eastern thought. So I hope this answers the question regarding the question of the author. I would suggest you to read this Jain philosophy juxtaposition with quantum-like framing by Sudeep Patra. So, yes. Any other question?
Thank you. Yeah, I think we have two hands because I saw Rahul Singh Pawar's hand going first, and then Ishan. Rahul is a student, Varun. I taught him at Hindu College. So Rahul, yes, please ask your question.
Am I audible?
Yes,
Hello?
you
Yes, Rahul.
First of all, amazing talk with the amount of topics that you touched upon. I'm not even sure if I can pose my questions well enough with all of that going into my head, from biology to technology, everything. Yeah. So I just wanted to touch upon the skepticism that you did highlight in your book review, but was not able to find a place in this talk, maybe because of the paucity of time. But yeah, I have a few questions. The first one is that, well, uh, contrasting or competing theories such as Chalmers' naturalistic dualism and even the functionalism of the functionalist does not take uh, individuals to be binary actors, but probabilistic automatons with probabilities. So, first I want to ask is how is the probability of a quantum wave function different from the classical notion that that Putnam or any functionalist poses with his probabilistic automaton? Then I want to ask again then how are we here different from the naturalistic dualism of Chalmers, which also gives us a ontology where information has a fundamental place in reality. And then, as this theory poses itself as an answer to the mind-body problem, how are we again going away from the fundamental question that Queen of Bohemia asked from Descartes, that how are mind and body created? Are we just not uh, taking the question back a step, where now bringing in the bringing in quantum theory into this, one can still ask how is it that quantum mechanics and the social are connected? Well, we can see the connection, but how? Just as how the Princess of Bohemia asked Descartes, how are the mind and the body connected? Also, very interesting talk. Another thing that I was very intrigued by and wanted you to talk more about is the relegation of the ontological aspect of things in social sciences, whereas it is easy to understand that when it comes to oppressive oppressive, oppressive, oppressive dialogues where we talk about Canadian Aboriginal ontologies being repressed. But why was the same term taken by existentialism or critical theory or any of the modern social sciences? Why are they so relevant upon phenomenology, if I can say that? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Rahul. These are really, really important questions. In fact, these are brilliant questions, I would say. You are pointing, you're bringing David Chalmers, you are bringing functionalist, and you're saying, you're asking this question that how is Chalmers, David Chalmers is a very important philosopher of mind who coined this term called the hard problem of consciousness, which is this problem that why do we have this inner subjective experience, feeling of I or phenomenal experience, or to put it differently, he expounded this problem like this, that why are we not philosophical zombies? It's important to frame this problem first, which means that philosophical zombies means that why do we have consciousness? Because evolution would have produced zombies if the purpose of evolution is just dissemination of genes. So, what is the role of consciousness in evolution? Why are we not philosophical zombies? And is consciousness real? And this is the hard problem of consciousness, which is actually the problem for materialism. Remember, Rahul, because you have read Chalmers and Functionalists, so I'm sure that you might be knowing this, that Chalmers' solution is also somewhat similar to what Wendt is saying. Without Chalmers going into quantum mind hypothesis, though remember, recently, I'm not sure whether you are aware of this, but Chalmers is also engaging with another philosopher. His name is Terence McCain or someone like Terence, some other thinker, some other philosopher of science, and they are reviving another important interpretation of quantum mechanics and its relatability to consciousness, which is not quantum mind hypothesis, rather which is called consciousness causing the wave function collapse. Which is different from quantum mind, because quantum mind argues that wave function collapse produces consciousness, But this idea that consciousness causes wave function collapse, which is actually an old idea, which has been existing since which is one of the founding interpretations, or one of the central interpretations, early interpretations of quantum mechanics, given by Eugene Wigner and John von Neumann. This idea that it's the observer, it's the conscious observer that causes the wave function collapse. They are trying to revive that idea, which has implications, philosophical implications. So remember, Chalmers is not going into quantum mind, but he is actually going into is still going into other interpretations of quantum mechanics, and he is providing a solution. He's provided this solution since 1990s, the time when he framed hard problem of consciousness. The solution is very simple. You're right when you said that he's a dualist, but remember, his dualism is property dualism, not substance dualism, and he has moved beyond that. He has embraced panpsychism, he has embraced quantum panpsychism, not the quantum mind, but quantum panpsychism. So perhaps the level of commonality between Wendt's work, quantum mind, and Chalmers is that both of them embrace some form of panpsychist model as a solution to the hard problem. And the second question is, I just lost. What was the second question, Rahul?
Oh Lord. I asked you about this, David Chalmers, and then
Yeah.
I wanted you to talk about well, functionalism and how probabilities in the quantum model are different from the
Yes, and you
functionalist
also talked about
probabilistic
dualism,
quantum mechanics.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah. So remember, I see functionalism is very simple. Functionalism is computationalism in one way or the other, because functionalists would argue that they take this model of consciousness being computational, and if consciousness is computational, then perhaps it can be it is real, but it is real in the sense that if you have the hardware, if you have the proper hardware, then you can emulate it. So the implication of functionalism is that artificial intelligence is actually conscious. And but remember, Rahul, I'm sure you must have read this, that functionalism has been debunked not by, forget about quantum mind hypothesis to debunk functionalism. It has been debunked since 1960s only by a philosopher named John Searle with this thought experiment called Chinese room experiment. And the whole crux of Chinese room experiment was that there is a fundamental difference between consciousness being computation and consciousness dealing with understanding. And consciousness is about understanding. It's not about computationalism, which functionalism espouses. So I don't know whether it answers your question, but remember, functionalism is not a very serious idea in philosophy of mind in contemporary times. But next question that you asked, which is about dualism, that is it the case that quantum mind hypothesis provides us a firm solution to dualism? I think it is. Because remember, dualism is what? Dualism is this thing that mind and body are two distinct entities, and the basic premise of Descartes is that they are connected through something called the pineal gland. And but we know that if modern science is correct, then dualism is incorrect, or if dualism is correct, then modern science is incorrect. But quantum mind is actually proposing a scientific idea, not just a philosophical idea, which phenomenology is. And there lies the difference between phenomenological interpretations and quantum interpretations. Remember, Rahul, phenomenology, whether, and in fact, there are good writings on this, like Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology and quantum mechanics. There is a very important scholar I must mention. His name is Michel Bidbol, a French philosopher of science. He talks about these things, that the connection between phenomenology and quantum. But as far as my understanding is concerned, there is a fundamental difference between phenomenological theorization. Both of them draw on consciousness, no doubt, but one is anti-metaphysical and anti-ontological, and in fact has deep aversion to these metaphysical speculative logic, and the other is rooted in certain metaphysics. And which one is which one. So phenomenology is anti-metaphysical at its core. That's where all these phenomenologists from Husserl to Heidegger to Merleau-Ponty, even Wittgenstein to some extent, they are also talking about consciousness, and they're also talking about relationality, but they're not going deep into the metaphysics of it. But quantum provides you a firm ground, not just for the subjectivity to exist in the quotidian sense, but also a metaphysical, ontological ground for the subjectivity. So that is the fundamental difference. And in my thesis, in my PhD thesis, I've highlighted this difference very, uh, I would say I have tried highlighting this difference. So if you want, I can share my work with you if this is what your question is. So, but these are very important questions, I must say. Thank you so much.
I had another question, the last
Yeah,
one. It was that what explains the aversion of of existentialists
yeah.
or
Very good
critical
question. Yeah. See, existentialists, remember, Rahul, they have always, although they are not, all of them are not phenomenologists, but remember when we talk about existentialism, remember when we talk about Heidegger, we talk about existentialist phenomenology. So phenomenologists and existentialists have collaborated. In fact, there is an overlap. So I would say existentialism also gives primacy to phenomenology over metaphysics. And that is where the difference lies. From, I mean, the early days of existentialism, from Dostoevsky to Sartre, all of them have not gone deep into these scientific inquiries and deep metaphysical philosophical inquiries. They have, I would say, visceral aversion, not hatred, but aversion to metaphysics. And that is the whole point of Heidegger, was that we have been doing philosophy in a very wrong fashion since the time of Plato, because we have been doing metaphysics rather than doing phenomenology. So existentialism, to put it very simply, existentialism is not a school, at least to me, I could be wrong, but at least to me, existentialism is not a school that exists in clear cut, disentangled manner from phenomenology. It overlaps with phenomenology in so many ways. So I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Varun. We have Ishan, Dr. Ishan Shahi, whose hand is also raised. I think Ishan wants to say something. Ishan, we cannot hear you, so you'll have to probably unmute yourself first.
Okay. Hello, Varun bhai. Long time no see. I hope you can hear me now.
Yes, Ishan, yes, please.
So effectively, I've read the review paper that was shared with all of us. And what I understood from it was that you wanted that thrust of your work and argument has been highlighting the limitations of materialist social theory, and has been highlighting the limitations of materialist social theory, uh, and also showcasing how contemporary social sciences have failed to understand the question of subjectivity. I mean, on the contrary, the way I've been thinking for long, I've not been doing it in a very systematic manner. So forgive me for the ad hocism that I'm going to engage in. But the way I've been thinking about social theory for some time has been quite the opposite. And it's more on the area of hedging and very limited hard materialism, which moves away from the domain of the subjective. So I'll give you an example of hard materialistic limited determination. So the surplus of computational power has allowed the same algorithms that were once, or similar algorithm and computational power that was once used to land people on the moon, is now being used to set up people on dating apps, right? And that changes the way in which socialization and intimate socialization takes place in contemporary society. However, how valid or helpful it is for us as social scientists to really dwell deeper into the question of what makes it, of what makes two specific individuals like each other, or match with one another, or the what. So to distinguish what is the social question, right, of, let's say, increasingly human life and intimate aspects of human life becoming commodified at the one hand, and how much of it can be investigate and as social scientists trying to investigate the inner nuance of romantic human life or intimate human contacts with one another. So that was effectively what I was aiming at, because for social sciences to be grounded on very solid objective or material grounds, they will have to limit their domains of explanation, because the more you try to exhaust description and explanation, the more shaky your grounds start to become. I'll leave. I hope what I've said is helpful for you to think.
Thank you so much, Ishan. I think this is an important question, but I think coming to the first point that you've raised, that perhaps you are coming from the more, I think you are right that this is my project also, and this is also the project that this is also the project of the thinkers that I'm following, to challenge some kind of materialism in some way or the other. But remember, materialism, Ishan, I'm sure you know this. I mean, materialism is a very loaded term, and the moment we say materialism, we could mean anything. For instance, if you, I think if you're familiar with this thing, this term, this another turn in philosophy called object-oriented ontology, or something called speculative realist school. People like Graham Harman and Quantine Mayhew, etc., which is a continental school. They have been, I think, pointing what, in some way or the other, you are trying to point out, that there is more of there is more into, rather than going more into the question of what subjectivity is, we should be knowing what matter is, or what objects are, and rather than going more into the domain of subjectivizing matter, we should rather do it the opposite way. So it is just the opposite in some way or the other, and which there is, I think, I have written a small piece in EPW Engage on Marxist ecology, wherein I have elaborated on this part of object-oriented ontology, that object-oriented ontology has a problem with this thing called correlationism, which means that, which is Kantian idea, that you can only know about the object with the help of a subject, not the object without the subject. So always there is a need in Kantian framework, which has been dominating social science, for some subject to exist. This is being challenged by object-oriented ontology, that we need to get rid of, we need to jettison the whole domain of subject, and we need to treat objects as primary, and we need to frame our social theory and not really social theory, but philosophy along the lines of more objectivity without positivistic objectivity. So they are not positivist, rather they are continental thinkers, but they are taking this side. And there are good articles written on, number of articles written on the implication of that object-oriented ontology and their mode of thinking on more social questions, on questions dealing with how to do research with objects. Like there is not a turn exactly, but there are good articles on object-oriented ontology, and the question of how to do research on the ground, the question of what is called uh, material turn in a manner wherein matter is taken seriously rather than without vitalizing matter. Remember, Wendt and these people are vitalizing matter in some way or the other, which means they are trying to argue that matter is vibrant. But object-oriented ontology is saying that nothing is vibrant and everything is matter, and rather matter has its object, has its own agency, but not in the sense of subjectivity. So it's slightly complex, but I would say that probably my hunch is that your theorization is coming closer to what object-oriented ontologists are trying to propound. And I am taking a very different position. I respect object-oriented ontologists, but I'm not very sure about their ideas. Sure in the sense that how um, how viable their ideas are whenever in the light of the contemporary crisis that we are into. So I hope this answers your question, but my hunch is that your perspective was more closer to the object-oriented ontology.
We have Mallikarjun, who also probably wants to ask a question. Then we can get back to Ishan if Ishan has added comments. Mallikarjun?
Yeah. Hi, Varun. Wonderful talk. I just wanted to ask this thing about where you mention what you say, how the how Wendt and these thinkers are challenging the notion that individuals somehow exist in isolation or as atomic beings, and then they get into relationships. Rather, they are advocating for a position which says that it is through relationality that individuals come to emerge in the first place. Now, I was just wondering, would that lead to another sort of problem where we have this network of flux from which individuals become sort of these epiphenomena, and the more the network changes, it starts determining the individuals also. So is there an ontological space from which the individual then can resist the changes in his context, or does he come to be completely defined by the context? I was also thinking about this problem for quite some time. I wanted to know what you think.
Thank you so much, Mallikarjun. This is the very, very important question. I must say, very basic question, but yet extremely important. I think you are right. I was also thinking about this, that there could be another domination. We know that there's one kind of thinking which has been dominating, which is about that we being individualized, atomized entities and relegating relationality to the margin. But these modes of thinking can also turn the tables and can turn the tables in a fashion where there can be a hegemony of the other, hegemony of the relation. I would agree with you, but I would say that it still has importance in the sense, perhaps when it comes to, like I was pointing about the questions of ecological crisis. Now, when it comes to ecological crisis, this mode of thinking is important. But perhaps when it comes to something called jingoistic nationalism, something called some framing of fascism, which also can misuse these tropes in framing their politics and saying that we are all relational, and then delegating the individual to the margin by saying that there is nothing called an atomized quantum mind. We are all entangled always, all the time. There is this possibility, and I think these people need more theorization on this front. And I also have to think about this. So thank you so much for this question, Mallikarjun. I think this is the most important question. I have to deliberate on this, and this is a very important question. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Thank you, Malik. And are there any other questions, comments, suggestions? Okay. Thank you so much, Varun. And on behalf of the team TheDaak, some of us are already here: Sakshi, Sharada, Sanjitana, Satvik Raj, and Pratham, Jigyasa, Chetna. We're all part of the team. On behalf of the entire TheDaak team and TheDaak Baitak, we thank you so much. We extend our most heartfelt gratitude towards you for taking out the time and speaking to us about a subject that I know personally that you're very passionate about and you've been working so hard about. I also want to add something to this discussion, which is that these are conversations that are mostly either not done because they're not primarily not understood, because these are cumbersome conversations, because we don't know what some of this stuff is and we've not read them. So I think one problem is that it's really a structural thing, but I also think that there's a certain way in which takes tremendous academic, intellectual honesty and courage to talk about stuff that has not been talked about in order to at least kind of open up newer dimensions. And I think Varun, for me, has done that consistently at the center. So in some senses, I also wanted for us to engage with this work and probably learn something, so that we could also be, for lack of better word, active, passionate participants to the work that and to the method that Varun is trying to build. So thank you so much, Varun, for giving TheDaak the opportunity to learn from you, and for all the questions and participants who've stayed with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Jigyasa. And thank you so much to the whole team. I think it's a great platform, and I wish you all the success. And future also, if there is any requirement for any such engagement conversation, I'm always there. So thanks a lot. Thank you.
Absolutely. And of course, this is going to be a long-standing. I hope that we continue coming back to some of these questions again and again. Hopefully not in order to raise further questions and not resolve all of them right away. But thank you so much, everybody. Next Saturday, we will come back with another BETAC, and we'll keep you posted. Thank you so much. Thank you. Good evening, everybody.